House cat fights off dogs to rescue Bobcat Cub. Now the rescue restores a lost family. The jacket hung on the back of the bedroom door. Green canvas worn soft at the elbows. Smelling faintly of motor oil and something else Elliot Granger could never quite name. Pine, maybe, or youth. He saw it every morning when he woke, and every morning he thought about taking it down, folding it away somewhere dark where he wouldn't have to look at it. But his hands never obeyed. It had been Nathan's, his son, gone now for 7 years. The morning it happened was ordinary. February, the sky still dark at 6, frost thick on the windows. Elliot had just finished his coffee when Gracie started making a sound he'd never heard before. Not a meow, something sharper, more urgent. She leaped off the chair and bolted toward the door, her body low and tense. Elliot frowned. Gracie never acted like this. She was calm, lazy even, spending most of her days sleeping or staring out at the birds. He pulled on his boots and coat and followed her outside. The cold hit him immediately, sharp and clean. The snow from the night before was fresh, unbroken except for Gracie's paw prints leading toward the old equipment shed at the edge of the property. Elliot heard barking, vicious and close, and his stomach dropped. He moved faster, his breath coming hard. When he reached the shed, he stopped. Gracie stood at the entrance. Her fur puffed out so she looked twice her size, her back arched. In front of her were 2 days, strays by the look of them, their teeth bared, growling low. And behind Gracie, half hidden in the snow, was something small and bloodied. A bobcat cub, no bigger than his hand. Its left hind leg was torn, bleeding dark against the white snow. One of the dogs lunged. Gracie sprang forward, slashing its muzzle. The dog yelped and fell back, but the other one circled, looking for an opening. Elliot didn't think. He grabbed the rusted shovel leaning against the shed and brought it down hard on the frozen ground. The sound cracked through the air. He shouted, his voice hoarse and raw, surprising even himself with its force. The dogs hesitated, then turned and ran. Elliot stood there, chest heaving, his hands shaking on the shovel handle. Gracie turned and carefully picked up the bobcat cub in her mouth, holding it as gently as if it were made of glass. She walked toward Elliot and stopped at his feet, looking up at him. He stared down at the tiny, broken creature in her mouth. His hands wouldn't move. He was afraid of holding something so fragile, afraid of what his rough, clumsy hands might do to it. The bobcat cub made a small, pitiful sound, and something in Elliot's chest cracked open. He knelt down slowly, his knees protesting, and held out his hands. Gracie set the bobcat cub into his palms. It was warm, breathing, alive. Elliot was 74 years old, his back permanently bent from decades of farm work, his hands thick with calluses that caught on everything. The house had been quiet for so long, he'd forgotten what it felt like to have something depend on him. He ate his meals standing at the counter. He slept with the television on. He rarely spoke except to Gracie, the cream-colored cat who had appeared on his porch 5 winters ago, thin and shivering, and who he'd let inside only because the cold that year had been brutal. He hadn't wanted a cat. Cats were useless, he'd always thought. They didn't guard anything, they didn't herd, they just existed, demanding food and warmth, offering nothing in return but their presence. But Gracie had stayed, and over time, Elliot had stopped noticing her as an intrusion. She slept on the armchair by the window, the same chair Nathan used to curl up in with his library books. And sometimes when Elliot walked past and saw her there, his throat tightened in a way that made him turn away quickly. Now, carrying this tiny wounded creature inside, Gracie following close behind. Elliot felt something shift. He found an old towel in the linen closet, the one with the frayed edges that he'd been meaning to throw out for years, and spread it on the floor near the fireplace. He set the bobcat cub down as carefully as he could, then stood back, unsure what to do next. Gracie didn't hesitate. She curled herself around the bobcat cub, her body forming a warm, protective circle. She began licking the wound on its leg. Slow and methodical. Elliot watched them. He thought about Nathan. About the time Nathan had brought home a baby bird that had fallen from its nest. And Elliot had told him to put it back outside. That nature would take its course. that they couldn't save every injured thing that crossed their path. Nathan had cried. Elliot had been unmoved. The bird had died that night. He hadn't thought about that moment in years. Now it felt like a stone lodged in his throat. He found the first aid kit under the bathroom sink and brought it back to the fireplace. His hands were steadier now. He cleaned the Bobcat Cub's leg with warm water and antiseptic, then wrapped it carefully with gauze. The Bobcat Cub flinched but didn't fight. Gracie watched him, her green eyes calm and steady, as if she trusted him completely. When he finished, Elliot sat back on his heels. The Bobcat Cub burrowed into Gracie's fur, already half asleep. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Elliot hadn't cried in 7 years. Not at the funeral. Not when he'd packed up Nathan's room. Not when he'd found the jacket and couldn't bring himself to let it go. But now, sitting on the floor with a half-wild animal and a stray cat, he felt the tightness in his chest loosen just enough to let something through. He didn't name the Bobcat Cub right away. Naming felt too permanent, too much like claiming. But Gracie acted as if the decision had already been made. She groomed the cub, let it nurse from her even though she had no milk to give, kept it warm through the cold nights. After a week, when it became clear the cub would survive, Elliot started calling her Sierra. He wasn't sure why. The name just came to him one morning, and it stuck. Nathan had wanted a cat. Elliot remembered that now with painful clarity. Nathan had been 12, maybe 13, and he'd asked for a cat for his birthday. Elliot had said no. Cats were messy. They scratched furniture. They didn't earn their keep. Nathan had looked at him with those hurt eyes and said nothing, just nodded and walked away. Elliot had thought he was teaching Nathan something important, about practicality, about not getting attached to things that couldn't help you, about being strong. What he'd really been teaching him was that love had conditions, that softness was weakness, that wanting something just because it made you happy was foolish. Sierra grew quickly. By spring, she was twice the size she'd been when Elliot found her. Her coat thick and spotted, her eyes sharp and intelligent. She was wild in a way Gracie wasn't, full of energy and curiosity. She knocked things over. She climbed onto counters. She shredded the corner of the living room rug. Elliot's first instinct was always to yell, to correct, to discipline. One afternoon, Sierra jumped onto the side table and knocked over the lamp. It was a small thing, cheap ceramic, but Nathan had given it to Elliot for his birthday the year before he died. Elliot had protested that it was too much, that Nathan shouldn't waste money on things like that. Nathan had just smiled and said he'd wanted to get it, that he'd seen it and thought of his dad. The lamp hit the floor and shattered, pieces scattering across the hardwood. Elliot's hand came down hard on the table. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. His mouth opened, ready to deliver the lecture about being careful, about paying attention, about respecting other people's things. Sierra froze, her ears flat against her head, her body pressed low to the ground, her eyes wide with fear. And Elliot saw Nathan, 13 years old, standing in the kitchen after he'd accidentally broken a dish while washing up after dinner. Nathan's shoulders had been hunched, his head down, waiting for the lecture. Elliot had given it to him, had talked for 30 minutes about carelessness and responsibility and how actions had consequences. Nathan had apologized quietly, cleaned up the mess, and disappeared to his room. Elliot had thought he'd taught him something valuable. Now, looking at Sierra's frightened eyes, Elliot saw what he'd actually done. He'd taught his son to be afraid of making mistakes, to associate accidents with shame, to believe that one moment of clumsiness could erase everything good about who he was. Elliot's breathing was harsh. Sierra's body trembled. He looked at the broken lamp, the pieces scattered across the floor. It was just a thing, replaceable, meaningless compared to the living creature in front of him. "It's all right," he said quietly. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, rough with disuse. "It's all right, it was an accident." Sierra didn't move for a long moment. Then, cautiously, she crept forward and pressed her head against Elliot's leg. The gesture was trusting, forgiving in a way Elliot didn't deserve. He stood there, his hand resting lightly on her head, and realized he was shaking. He bent down and carefully picked up the pieces of the lamp, wrapping them in newspaper. As he worked, Sierra watched him, and gradually her body relaxed, her tail uncurling. That night, Elliot sat in the dark living room, Gracie on his lap, Sierra curled at his feet. He thought about all the times he'd corrected Nathan, all the moments when he could have said, "It's all right. Accidents happen. I'm not angry," instead of turning every mistake into a lesson about character and discipline. Nathan had died in a car accident 3 weeks after his 23rd birthday. A drunk driver, a rainy night, a curve taken too fast. The call had come at 4 in the morning. The police officer's voice had been professional, apologetic, final. "Your son was killed instantly. He didn't suffer." Elliot had driven to the hospital in silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles ached. He'd thought about all the things he'd meant to say, all the conversations he'd planned to have when Nathan was older, when they could talk man to man, when the distance between them would somehow magically close. He'd thought about the last time they'd spoken. 3 days before the accident, Nathan had called to say he'd gotten a promotion at work. Elliot had said that was good. That hard work paid off. That Nathan should keep his head down and not get too comfortable. He hadn't said he was proud. He hadn't said he loved him. He'd given advice, practical and cold, because that was what he knew how to do. By the time Elliot arrived at the hospital, Nathan was already gone. They'd let him see the body. Nathan had looked peaceful, younger than 23, his face unmarked despite the violence of the crash. Elliot had stood there for 20 minutes, his hand on Nathan's cold shoulder, trying to find words that wouldn't come. He'd thought he was preparing Nathan for the world, building resilience, teaching him that life was hard and you had to be harder. What he'd actually done was build a wall between them, brick by brick, lecture by lecture, until Nathan had learned to keep his distance, to share less, to expect judgment instead of understanding. Summer came. Sierra grew bolder, venturing farther from the house each day. Elliot watched her disappear into the tree line and tried not to think about all the ways she could be hurt, tried not to think about how easy it was to lose things. He'd been like this with Nathan too, he realized, constantly vigilant for danger, always preparing his son for the worst possible outcome. When Nathan had wanted to try out for the baseball team, Elliot had warned him about injuries. When Nathan had talked about going to art school, Elliot had lectured him about impractical degrees and uncertain futures. His own father had been the same way, silent, stern, measuring love in hours worked and bills paid. Elliot had learned early that affection was suspect, that real men showed love through provision and discipline, not words or embraces. He'd raised Nathan the same way, believing it would make him strong, make him capable, make him ready for a world that didn't care about feelings. He'd thought he was being realistic, protective. He'd thought he was saving Nathan from disappointment. What he'd actually done was teach his son that hope was dangerous, that wanting things led to pain, that it was safer to expect nothing than to risk being let down. One morning in late August, Sierra didn't come back. Elliot waited. He called for her, standing on the porch at dawn and dusk, his voice carrying across the empty fields. He walked the property, checking the shed, the barn, the places she'd like to sleep. Nothing. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Gracie grew listless, spending most of her time at the window, watching. Elliot caught himself doing the same thing. He blamed himself. He should have kept her inside, should have built a better fence, should have been more careful. The guilt felt familiar. It tasted like the guilt he carried about Nathan, the same questions circling endlessly. What if I'd been different? What if I'd said something? What if I'd just been softer, kinder, better at the funeral? People kept telling Elliot that Nathan had known he was loved, that sons always knew. Elliot had nodded, accepting their comfort, but he didn't believe it. How could Nathan have known Elliot had never said it? Not once. He'd thought there would be time. He'd thought that when Nathan was older, when he was a man, they'd talk differently, softer. He'd thought they'd reach some understanding, some place where words like that wouldn't feel so impossible. But that door had closed. And now there was no one left to ask, no one to forgive him, No way to know if Nathan had understood that the strictness, the distance, the constant corrections, had all been Elliot's broken, inadequate way of saying I love you. Winter came. The first snow fell on a Tuesday. Elliot stopped looking. It was a Tuesday in January when he saw her. He was carrying firewood from the shed, his arms full, his breath clouding in the cold air. Movement caught his eye at the edge of the property. He turned. Sierra stood at the tree line, larger now, her coat thick and lush against the cold, and her belly was swollen. She was pregnant. Elliot set down the firewood slowly, carefully, afraid that any sudden movement would send her running. He didn't approach. He just stood there, his heart pounding in a way that made his chest ache. Sierra watched him for a long moment. Then she began walking toward the house, her steps careful and deliberate, her body moving with the distinctive waddle of late pregnancy. Elliot opened the door and stepped aside, pressing himself against the wall to give her room. Sierra walked past him, through the house, her claws clicking on the hardwood. She went straight through the kitchen, out the back door that Elliot had left propped open, and into the shed beyond. Elliot followed at a distance, keeping back, letting her lead. Sierra nosed open the shed door and went inside, moving to the far corner where Elliot had found her that first morning, where Gracie had stood guard against the dogs. She circled once, twice, 3 times, then lay down on the old blanket Elliot had left there months ago. For the first time in his life, Elliot felt himself step back instead of forward. Every instinct told him to go to her, to check on her, to make sure she was all right. But he didn't. He stood in the doorway, watching as she settled herself, and he let her choose. Let her have control of something that was hers. Gracie found her way to the shed an hour later. She slipped past Elliot and curled up beside Sierra, purring softly. Sierra turned her head and touched noses with Gracie, a gesture of recognition and gratitude. Sierra gave birth that night. Elliot heard the sounds from the house, soft cries and rustling. He forced himself to stay inside, to let it happen without him. It was the hardest thing he'd done in years. When dawn came, he walked to the shed with a bowl of food and water. Sierra was lying in the corner, 4 tiny bobcat cubs nursing at her belly. Gracie was curled around them, keeping them warm. Elliot set down the bowls and backed away. He didn't reach out to touch the bobcat cubs, didn't pick them up to examine them. He just looked, and then he left. He sat on the porch steps as the sun rose, listening to the sounds of new life coming from the shed, and let himself feel something he hadn't allowed in years. Hope. The smallest bobcat cub had a crooked hind leg. Elliot noticed it the next morning when he brought fresh food. The bobcat cub dragged itself forward with his front paws, its back leg twisting awkwardly beneath it, unable to bear weight. His chest tightened. The practical thing, the merciful thing, would be to put it down. It would never survive in the wild with a leg like that. It would be a burden to Sierra, would slow down the others. These were the same kinds of calculations Elliot had made his whole life. The same logic he'd used to make decisions about Nathan. What was practical? What would make him stronger? What would prepare him for a harsh world? But standing there, watching the bobcat cub struggle, Elliot realized he didn't want to be practical anymore. He went to the workshop and found scraps of wood, 2 small wheels from an old toy truck, soft leather strips. He worked for 3 hours, measuring and adjusting, building a small cart that could strap to the bobcat cub's back legs and support its weight. When he finished, he brought it to the shed. Sierra watched him approach but didn't move. Elliot knelt down slowly, showing her the cart, letting her sniff it. Then, moving as gently as he could, he fitted it to the bobcat cub's back legs, adjusting the straps until they were snug but not tight. He set the bobcat cub down and watched it wheel itself across the floor of the shed. Clumsy at first, then with growing confidence. The bobcat cub moved in circles, exploring this new ability, its tail twitching with excitement. Sierra stood and walked over to the cub. She sniffed it carefully, then licked its face. A benediction, an approval. Elliot's eyes burned. He turned away quickly, walking back to the house before the tears could fall. He named the cub Joey, the name Nathan had called himself when he was small, before he'd learned to pronounce his own name properly. Nathan had been 3, maybe 4, pointing to himself in family photos and saying, Joey. Joey. Elliot had corrected him every time, insisting on the proper pronunciation. Catherine had laughed and let him say it however he wanted. Elliot wished now that he'd laughed too. The cubs grew. Gracie mothered them with a patience Elliot found almost painful to watch. She groomed them constantly, played with them for hours, taught them to eat slowly and carefully, to bury their waste, to be gentle with their claws. When they climbed on her, pulling her tail and batting at her ears, she never got angry, she just purred and let them play. Sierra was stricter, disciplined. She cuffed them when they got too rough, taught them to hunt the mice in the barn, showed them where to climb and where to hide. When they didn't listen, she would pin them down with one paw until they went still and quiet. But even her discipline was paired with affection. After every correction, she would groom them, licking their faces and ears until they purred. Elliot watched them and saw himself in Catherine, Nathan's mother, long gone now, dead from cancer when Nathan was 16. Catherine had been gentle, soft-spoken, quick to hug and praise. Elliot had been the disciplinarian, the one who enforced rules, who corrected mistakes, who kept Nathan in line. He'd thought they balanced each other. He'd thought Nathan needed both. But after Catherine died, there had only been Elliot, only the strictness, only the rules, only the constant corrections without any of the softness to balance them out. Nathan had withdrawn after Catherine's death, become quieter, more distant, or what Nathan had probably needed was permission to fall apart, to cry, to be weak for a while. But Elliot hadn't known how to give that permission because he'd never given it to himself. Once a year, on the anniversary of the day Gracie had saved Sierra, Elliot made pancakes, Nathan's favorite, blueberry, with real maple syrup, the expensive kind from Vermont. He set out 3 plates, one for Gracie, one for Sierra, one for himself. He put out small bowls of wet food for the Bobcat Cubs, the good kind from the pet store in town. He wore Nathan's jacket, even though it was too small in the shoulders now and smelled more like dust than anything else. He'd found things in the pockets over the years. A receipt from a gas station, a guitar pick, a folded piece of paper with a crude drawing of a cat, done in pen, signed with Nathan's childish signature from when he was 12. He didn't pray over the pancakes. He didn't say anything. He just ate in silence. And when he was finished, he washed the dishes and put them away. It was Sierra's birthday, but it wasn't. It was a memorial, a remembering, a way of holding on to something that wanted to slip away, a way of saying I'm sorry to someone who couldn't hear him. A man came to the farm in late spring. He was younger than Elliot, maybe 50, with a familiar face that Elliot couldn't quite place. The man stood at the edge of the porch, looking at the bobcat sprawled in the sun, Joey wheeling himself across the yard in pursuit of a butterfly. "Mr. Granger," the man said. Elliot nodded, wary. "I don't know if you remember me. I'm David Connolly. I went to school with Nathan." The name surfaced slowly. David, the kid with the glasses who used to come over to work on science projects. The one Nathan had been friends with before high school pulled them in different directions. "I remember," Elliot said. David looked at the bobcats again, a smile playing at his lips. "I heard you were keeping wild animals now. Didn't believe it until I saw it." He paused, his expression growing more serious. "Nathan used to talk about you. You know, we stayed in touch after school, had coffee sometimes. He talked about you a lot." Elliot's hands tightened on the porch railing. His heart was beating too fast. "He said you were tough," David continued. "Hard to read, that you never really said what you were feeling. But he also said he knew you loved him more than anything in the world. He said he could see it in the way you fixed things around the house before he even knew they were broken, in the way you always made sure his car was running right." Elliot's vision blurred. He blinked hard, his jaw tight. "He loved you the same way," David said softly. "He wanted to tell you that more often. He always said he was going to, that he needed to have a real conversation with you about it. I guess he thought there'd be more time." Elliot couldn't speak. His throat had closed up completely. He nodded once, a jerky movement. David stayed for a few more minutes, making small talk about his own life, his kids, his job. Then he left, his truck kicking up dust as it disappeared down the long driveway. Elliot stood on the porch long after the sound of the engine faded. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and pink. Joey wheeled himself up the porch steps, mewing for dinner. Sierra followed, her other three Bobcat Cubs trailing behind. That night, Elliot pulled out the shoebox from the back of his closet, the one with Nathan's things. Photos, report cards, the drawing of a cat, the letter from summer camp. He set the box on the floor beside where Gracie and Sierra slept, their bodies curled together, the Bobcat Cubs tucked between them. He didn't open it, just left it there, close, as if somehow bringing these two parts of his life into the same space might heal something that felt permanently broken. When the Cubs were a year old, strong and wild and restless, Elliot knew it was time. Sierra had been leading them farther into the woods each day, teaching them things Elliot couldn't: how to hunt, how to fight, how to survive in a world that wouldn't be kind to them, things only she could show them. He made collars from soft rope, braiding them carefully, attaching small bells so he might hear them if they ever came close to the house. He tied them carefully around each Bobcat Cub's neck, taking his time, making sure they fit properly. Joey's cart had been abandoned months ago. The Bobcat Cub, having learned to walk with a strange, loping three-legged gait that worked well enough. He'd grown strong, muscled, capable. Elliot hung a sign on the shed door. He'd carved it himself, working late into the night. The words burned into the wood with a soldering iron class of Sierra 1.0. Sierra stood at the edge of the tree line on a bright morning in June. Her Bobcat Cubs gathered around her. They were adults now, nearly as large as she was, their coats sleek and healthy. Elliot stood on the porch, his hands hanging empty at his sides. They looked at each other for a long moment. Elliot wanted to say something, to call them back, to keep them close where he could protect them. But he didn't. He'd learned, finally, that love meant letting go, that the tighter you held on, the more damage you did. Sierra turned and walked into the trees, her children following. Joey went last, his gait awkward but determined, his head held high. Elliot watched until they disappeared into the green shadows. His hands were empty. His house would be quieter. But he didn't feel hollow. He felt something else, something lighter, something that might, in time, feel like peace. 5 years passed. Elliot grew older, slower. His back hurt most mornings. He needed reading glasses. He forgot things sometimes. Small things like where he'd put his keys or whether he had already fed Gracie. Gracie's muzzle turned white. She slept more, moved less. But she still purred when Elliot sat beside her, still wound between his legs when he stood at the kitchen counter making coffee. The farm settled into a quiet rhythm, peaceful in a way it hadn't been in decades. Elliot still made pancakes once a year. He still wore Nathan's jacket, though it was threadbare now, the canvas so soft it felt like cloth. It was winter again when he heard the sound on the porch. Heavy footsteps, multiple animals moving together. Deliberate. Elliot's heart jumped. He set down the book he'd been reading and walked to the door, his hands shaking as he turned the knob. Sierra stood there, fully grown, magnificent, her coat thick and lustrous in the porch light. Her eyes were the same as they'd been the day Gracie saved her, intelligent and calm. Behind her were 4 bobcats, adults, strong and healthy. Joey was among them, his 3-legged stance distinctive. The first generation, all of them sitting in a neat row on his porch, looking at him. Elliot's legs gave out. He sat hard on the porch steps, his breath coming in short gasps. His hands were shaking. He didn't try to hide the tears that ran down his face, dripping onto his shirt. "You came back," he said, his voice breaking into pieces. "You came back." Sierra stood and walked forward. She pressed her forehead against Elliot's chest, a gesture of affection, of trust. Her children followed, one by one, rubbing against him, their rough tongues licking his hands. Gracie came to the door, moving slowly, her old bones stiff. Sierra and her children turned to her immediately. They approached her with reverence, each one touching noses with her. A greeting, a thank you, a recognition of the debt they owed. Elliot sat there, surrounded by wild things who had chosen to return, who remembered him, who trusted him enough to bring their families back to this place. And he felt the question he'd carried for 7 years. The question that had eaten at him in the dark hours. The question that had no answer. Finally loosen its grip. Did Nathan know he would never know for certain? There was no one left to ask. No way to reach back through time and undo his mistakes. Soften his words. Be the father he'd always meant to become. Eventually, when there was time, but sitting here, with Sierra and her children, with Gracie curled at his side, Elliot understood something he hadn't before. Love didn't end just because the person was gone. It changed shape. It found new ways to exist. And sometimes, if you were lucky, if you opened yourself to it, it came back. Not in the same form, not in the way you expected, but it came back. Sierra stayed the night, her children with her. They slept in the shed, curled together in a pile of fur and warmth. In the morning, Elliot made breakfast, setting out food for all of them. They ate together on the porch, the sun rising over the mountains, the air cold and clean. When they were done, Sierra stood. Her children stood with her. Elliot knew what was coming. He stood too, his old joints protesting. Sierra looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned and walked toward the tree line, her family following. This time, Elliot didn't feel hollow as he watched them go. He felt grateful, grateful that they'd come back, grateful that they'd trusted him enough to show him their families, grateful for the gift of this moment, this small piece of grace he didn't deserve but had been given anyway. He went inside and took Nathan's jacket off the chair by the window. He folded it carefully, his hands moving slowly over the worn canvas. He didn't put it away in a closet. He didn't throw it out. He just moved it to the back of the chair, where he could still see it, but where it wasn't the first thing he saw every morning. It was still there, still part of the house, but it wasn't a shrine anymore. It wasn't a monument to guilt and regret. It was just a jacket, a memory, a piece of someone he'd loved, poorly and imperfectly, but truly. Elliot made coffee and stood at the kitchen window, watching the sun climb higher in the sky. Gracie wound between his legs, purring somewhere in the forest. Sierra was teaching her grandchildren to hunt, to survive, to live. He'd done it wrong with Nathan. He knew that. He'd been too hard. He'd built walls when he should have built bridges. He'd lectured when he should have listened. He'd prepared Nathan for a harsh world instead of creating a soft place for him to rest. But here, with these animals who asked nothing of him but presence, he'd learned something. He'd learned to step back, to let go, to trust that love didn't have to be controlling to be real. It was too late for Nathan, but it wasn't too late for this, for Sierra and her children and their children after them, for Joey and his crooked leg and his fierce determination, for Gracie, who had started all of this by refusing to abandon something small and hurt and helpless. The jacket stayed on the chair. The memory stayed in his chest. The question stayed unanswered. And maybe it always would, but the door stayed open. And when something small and hurt and helpless showed up in the snow, Elliot would be there to bring it inside, to tend its wounds, to let it go when it was ready. That was enough. It had to be. It was all he had left to give. Elliot stood at the window as the morning stretched on. Gracie warm against his legs, the house quiet around him. He thought about his son. He thought about the bobcats who came back. He thought about all the ways love could break you and put you back together in a different shape. And for the first time in 7 years, he felt something that might, eventually, become forgiveness. Not for Nathan, who had nothing to forgive, but for himself, for all the ways he'd failed, for all the things he'd done wrong, for being human and flawed and incapable of being the father he'd wanted to be. The sun climbed higher. The day opened before him. And Elliot Granger, 74 years old, bent and weathered and carrying sorrows he'd never fully set down, made himself another cup of coffee and decided that today he would try to be a little gentler, a little softer, a little more like the person his son had deserved. It was all he could do. And somehow, standing in his quiet kitchen with the jacket on the chair and the memory in his heart, it felt like enough. Every rescue begins with a heartbeat that refuses to give up. We're grateful you chose to listen to this one. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, a simple like or subscribe means the world to us.